Hi, everyone. I am so thrilled to be able, finally, to introduce you to three very special people. They are the first rock musicians, even heavy metal musicians, with whom I've quickly become and am becoming friends. We had an online meeting a few weeks ago, and we set it up as a premiere for you because I want you to meet them as well. So you will find out all about them today, and this is also where you get to find out the details of my rock history project plans. So, without any further ado, please meet my three heavy metal musician friends. Well, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here, my Canadian friends, and I want to introduce you to my audience and my audience to you. So in the center we have Carl, who is the one who's going to be working with me on a project. We'll tell you more about that in a moment, or in a few moments. And then we have Graham and Tice, and I would like each of them to give a little bit of background about who they are. But I just want to say in just up front, these three have generously offered their time and knowledge and expertise, and I'm excited about what we have coming up together. And let's just start off by having Carl talk about himself and introduce himself, and then pass it to whomever you think ought to, and let's go from there.
Sure, great, thanks. Hi, everybody. My name is Carl Fitzgerald Sloman. You can tell by the way I'm dressed, I'm not like everybody else. I happen to be a member of the Canadian Armed Forces. I'm a captain in the Canadian Forces. The only reason I'm dressed this way tonight is because I left work and then I came straight to the music school, which I own, to teach. And I forgot to bring a change of clothes. So you're stuck with me in this garb for the time being. But in future, I will probably be dressed more in normal clothing, usually with a Rush t-shirt on. Anyway, a little bit about me. I started music when I was 7 years of age. I'm a classically trained pianist. And I enjoyed music and I wanted to play music. It wasn't something my parents forced me into. And as I carried on, I discovered my love of then pop rock music. I'm old, I'm 60 years of age, so I was very heavily into the Beatles, and I remember them when they were still together performing. Because of that influence, I fell in love with Ringo Starr, the drummer of the band, and I decided that although I enjoyed playing the piano, the drums seem more appealing to me and would eventually become my destiny, and what it is I do is my forte, pardon the pun. So I took up drumming in a Scottish pipe band where I learned all my fundamentals. At the same time, I picked up guitar because I was interested in what the guitar was all about, but I certainly am not as accomplished as this guy beside me, but he'll talk about that later. And I carried on through music throughout high school. Played in symphonic bands as a tuba player in one of the top schools of music in North America. And then after I'd finished that up, I joined the Canadian military. I was offered a position as a musician in the Canadian military, but because I wanted to be an officer, I decided that where I would be going with the military was slightly different. So I became what's called a combat arms officer, and I'm an artillery officer. Anyways, with that gave me the opportunity to travel all over the world and gave me also the envious position of being able to discover music in different cultures. I did 3 operational tours, 2 of them in Bosnia at the turn of the century, and I also did a 4-year stint in Germany during the Cold War, version 1, because right now we're going through Cold War version 2. So I had an opportunity to spend a lot of time in Europe, Scandinavia, and then, of course, in Eastern Europe when I was in Bosnia. I've done extensive travel all over the United States as well. Throughout this entire period, I joined my first band when I was about 16 years of age, back in 1979, and I've been playing semi-professionally and professionally ever since. I wrote a book on drumming called The Coordination Code. which was published by Alfred Music in 2012. And I am considered to be a fairly accomplished drummer as far as drummers and drumming is concerned. I play a total of 13 instruments, many of them at various competency levels, but drums are my first love. I have lots of other experience doing things. I've owned 3 music schools, and I was also featured in a documentary because I started a program for people with disabilities with cerebral palsy. And I invented a system whereby the students could access musical instruments through the headrests in their wheelchairs. And a documentary was made called Walk the Walk. You can look for it on YouTube. You won't find the whole documentary, but you'll at least find the trailer, where I was honored by the super Canadian rock band Rush. So since then, I've been carrying on with my music school and my military career. I have extensive knowledge on rock music because I essentially went through it all. Starting in the late 70s as a rock drummer and carrying on my way through to present day. So I've seen how music has changed throughout all of those years from a drummer's perspective, but also in general idea as a musician in general. I also was fortunate enough to play with the 2 gentlemen beside me. They'll introduce themselves in a moment. We all were together in a heavy metal band called Opus Rex, where we did progressive metal. Again, more on that at a later time. And that's essentially it about me. I'm sure we will talk more in future, myself and Amy, and I can provide any additional information at that time. Over to you, Graham.
Okay.
Hold on just a second.
Yeah.
I want to just say that we'll include the link to the little documentary about you because I think it's fabulous. And as a teacher myself, and somebody who works with disabled students as well, you know, that was one of the things when we were first getting acquainted. I was like, I think I have found a kindred spirit in the teaching world here. And well, the story of how we got acquainted should maybe be talked about too. But let's go ahead and finish the introductions and
Sure. And
then
make sure
we'll
you bring
go
that
on.
to that you're also in Walk the Walk. Then.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Although they certainly won't recognize me in the video.
No.
That's right. So my name is Graham Floyd. I'm the guitar player here in the school that we work with. Again, a little bit about myself, my background. I started in music from a very early age, but I actually started mostly as an audience member and a drag-along, I guess you could call. My father was involved in a semi-professional folk band from as long as I can remember. So I actually have quite a lot of memories traveling around through Ontario and going to music festivals and performances that he was involved with. So music was always a part of my family. It was always around. There were always practices that were going on. At about the age of 7, I expressed an interest to my parents for wanting to learn to play the piano. And although starting that at that age, I actually had a bit of a talent for the instrument. I could sight read fairly easily the music that was provided. The downside of that was I didn't really understand what practicing was. So after about a year and a half, maybe 2 years of just kind of breezing my way through the beginner material, I hit a wall, and I really didn't get much better beyond that. So I carried on with the piano and kind of stagnated for a while until eventually the teacher I was studying with at the time kind of said, you know, you haven't really done much with this. Why don't we just kind of finish with things? But at that point, I had discovered the guitar. And in particular, and I know that a lot of this conversation, a lot of the videos that you're planning on doing have to do with rock music. It was actually, I guess technically a rock band, if you can categorize it as that. It was the music of Metallica that I found. And having come from more of a classical side, it was an album that they recorded live with an orchestra that bridged those two worlds for me, and that's what brought me into the world of rock and metal and I guess popular music.
That's interesting.
So I started into the guitar, and unlike the piano, I couldn't play it initially. I was not gifted with the instrument, so I really had to work very, very hard, but I wanted it. I wanted to be able to play. And my parents, of course, you can imagine, my father being a musician, they were very supportive. They They brought me into lessons to study, and I had lots and lots of opportunities. My brother played, and we had friends who played. So there was a lot of kind of social aspects that went with learning to play, not just necessarily studying completely on my own. Now, as I progressed on the instrument, the instructor that I worked with recognized that I had a real passion for learning to play and wanting to play, and so he would actually feed me things to try and musicians to check out. And I think probably one of the most important ones that I was introduced to was a guitar player called Yngwie Malmsteen, who I was introduced to at about 15. And once again, I couldn't play the stuff. And if you know the music, if you've heard the stuff, you can understand why. It's incredibly complicated, but my teacher was very patient with me, and I guess I must have just kept at it long enough, and eventually I was able to start to play some of the material, which was awesome to be able to do at that age. Now, outside of that, the piano instructor who I mentioned before, who kind of said, maybe this isn't what you want to be doing, I found out later on, and he was an older gentleman who lived on my street. That's kind of how I connected with him. He was actually on the faculty at the local university, which is the University of Western Ontario, that Tice will mention when he talks about himself. So I actually returned to study with him, learning specifically about music theory and learning about harmony and composition and a lot of stuff that I was not really aware even existed in music. So I worked with him for a number of years privately, which once again opened my eyes to a new world of possibilities. Back on the rock and metal side, I was introduced to yet another band who would become a huge, huge influence on me, and that was the music of Dream Theater. I had a friend of mine who actually put together a compilation CD and said, hey, you got to check out these guys and see what you think. And I was immediately hooked and got into the music. So now about this time, I'm about 18 years old and finishing up high school, and I've got to start thinking about, what am I going to do with my life? And although I really wanted to pursue music academically, unfortunately, at least where we are in the world, there really isn't something for rock and heavy metal and contemporary guitar in post-secondary work, at least not readily available. So I actually went in to the University of Western Ontario, and I studied physics, believe it or not, and I also studied computer science. And I stuck with it for the full program. I finished my degree. I actually worked as a system analyst for a little while after I finished, but I constantly worked behind the scenes, learning music, self-studying. I had some bands that I worked with. I actually had a local church band that I had been playing with pretty much every week. So we had a gig every week that we played from about the age of 16. So it was great development on the performance side. Now, as I was getting into my last year of university, I was, through a friend of the family, introduced to Carl. And the introduction was really in the form of a job. He was looking for teachers. He needed guitar teachers for a school that he was opening up. I actually happened to live just around the corner from where the new school was, and I needed an income. I needed something to kind of offset my tuition costs, and so I started working for Carl. And I essentially never stopped since then. That eventually blossomed into working together in a number of different musical projects, including Falling Into Infinity, which was a Rush and Dream Theater tribute group that we worked with. Of course, Trainwreck, which was the disabled program that Carl mentioned before. And of course, I'm also featured in the documentary, although a much smaller role than Carl, because he was really the real brains and passion behind the program. And then eventually, of course, Opus Rex that we worked with together. So we continue to run the school. We continue to develop what we do here in London, Ontario. And I actually also, outside of this school, I have an online business that I run that focuses on teaching guitar. I've got a number of books and courses and things that I provide. And I actually also have a separate YouTube channel, which, at some point I can give you more information if you'd like. It's just my name, nothing fancy. So.
Okay.
All right.
So Tice.
Yeah, so I'm the last piece here. My name's Tice. I got involved with the guys, as Carl mentioned, from being one of his drum students early on, but I early, probably from the age of 4 or 5, I was doing a lot of piano as a student. Took lessons with my dad, would come along with me, little group classes with other kids, and I just kept at it for a long time until I got to a point where I found that like classical music, and that's sort of the stream I was pigeonholed in for a lot of my piano education, just wasn't doing it for me anymore. And that's when I started turning to drums. Obviously rock music's a big impact there. Carl turned me on to bands like you said, Rush, Dream Theater, things that I just didn't really understand at first, and that I think was the big hook. I have a very like mathematical mind, and so that played well with all that kind of music. In high school, I got the opportunity to play in a jazz band, which sort of reignited my love for piano and keyboard. Luckily for me, it was a bunch of friends in the high school jazz band, and they didn't have a piano player, so I showed up. That ended up turning into sort of my first extracurricular band. We kept going outside of high school, wrote our own songs, did our own shows, and that gave me the itch to keep playing, keep performing, and have a life with music. All through high school, I played with a lot of bands, obviously with Graham and Carl in our band Opus Rex and some other iterations before that. And then I decided to go to Western University for music composition, and the instrument I actually signed up for was percussion. So I did a lot of percussion, orchestral percussion, symphonic percussion stuff, some jazz. But the focus of my courses was mostly composition. Got the chance to study with a lot of great professors and teachers, world-renowned composers while I was there. Had the chance to have pieces performed by groups. And that was all a really good experience for the composition side. I took that a little bit to what we do now, sort of more rock focused, metal focused. I do some work with indie bands and pop bands, but the classical composition is really its own thing, its own field that I loved while I was doing it. Since university, I've obviously started school with the two guys here. We've had a couple locations. I've been teaching as a piano and drum teacher for probably 12 years now, since Carl brought me on after being a student. And I keep performing to this day. I have my day job and love coming here at night where we teach and get to talk music and other stuff. Yeah.
That's great.
Okay, and one of the things I'd like to point out, Amy, is that took a fair amount of time to get through, but it's important for your audience to realize.
It's important for everybody to
we're not. Yeah, we're not just three guys that showed up off the street to talk. We have a significant background both on the classical side and the rock side. Yes. Over to you.
Well, I have a question that I want to ask before I forget about it, and that is that Tice mentioned, and this is something that I'm curious about from the teacher's perspective as well. Tice said that he was kind of pigeonholed in classical, and it didn't really do that much for him beyond a certain point, and so he started getting into drums and stuff. I am curious, and then of course I heard Graham say, well, it was the music reading, the sight reading that was really the killer for him. I understand that. I've seen students in that situation, but I'm curious as far as you, Tice, what do you feel it was? Because then you went to school and studied essentially a course which is quite heavily classically rooted, It's probably, it may have been a modern version of classical, right? But still, it's classically rooted, and that's composition in university courses at this point. So what was it that made it to where classical wasn't relevant to you early on, and then eventually you came back to it?
I think a big part of it was, to a degree, just having a break from it. I stopped piano probably when I was 12, 13, and at that point got to experience playing with other musicians, playing jazz music, playing rock and metal music, and when I went and signed up for university, it was never my goal to get back into classical music or to revisit that. I just saw an opportunity to be around musicians all day, every day, and of that kind of caliber. To me, it didn't really matter what it was.
So it was more the social element that kind of reignited your love for music and then kept it going and directed you into.
Yeah, and I think, obviously, I knew why I quit when I was that age. Why I quit piano and classical music, but I think I always knew there was something more, and that's probably what I was looking for, and why I took the percussion angle is, okay, let's see what this takes. And the composition side, I don't know if it's specific to Western University. There's probably more focus on modern, lean on almost avant-garde, like very.
That's pretty typical in a lot of universities at this point, as far as composition.
Yeah, and that intrigued me a little more. I'd say a lot more, actually. 'Cause that's why I signed up for it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Before we go on further, let's kind of talk about how Carl and I got acquainted, because this all happened in such a unplanned, unprogrammed way, and it's developed very quickly, very beautifully. I'm just now meeting the other two of you, but I guess we've been acquainted with Carl for a little while now. So my first contact with Carl actually came from a comment he left on in fact, Vlad's telling me exactly 1 month ago to the day, he left a comment on my new experimental Virgin Rock channel and said that he was impressed with what I was doing, and he liked it, and he wanted to volunteer, offer his help in any way, and I was kind of wary and cautious and unsure, what's this? Is it legit? Whatever. But he left enough information about himself in the message that I was able to kind of do a little bit of a background check online and see, yeah, okay, that's really the guy, and yes, what he's saying about himself is true, and this could be interesting and a unique opportunity. So I replied, and it took us a little bit to get the contact going. Again, partly because I was very cautious and I wasn't giving away my personal info very quickly. But eventually we made contact via email, and not long after we did a Zoom call to get acquainted, and he sent me a gift in the mail, which is his coordination code book, which he's written, and he signed it and wrote this lovely message inside, and that's like a special thing to me. So I'm not a percussionist, as you all know. I don't play drums, but looking through the book, I was fascinated, and at his approach, at his way of breaking things down and presenting things. And again, from a teacher's perspective, I was like, this guy knows what he's talking about. And so then I kind of opened up a bit more, and communication started flowing a bit more, and we've been talking regularly and coming up with all sorts of ideas and plans. And so that's kind of how, from my side, it developed. Now, Carl, maybe you want to tell your side of the story.
Certainly. Thanks, Amy. You are correct. I sent a note to you of encouragement on YouTube because I was incredibly impressed with what I had seen. I'm an avid YouTube follower, although normally you'll find me on Tesla channels, but I do like to watch a lot on music. And when I saw you, you were different than everybody else. I'm not going to name any of the other channels, but I have seen many, many, many videos of people who are doing reaction videos. And unfortunately, on many of them, I had to question the honesty that was being put forward. In that there were many people, oh, this is the first time we've heard this. You're telling me that you've never heard these 75 songs which are played everywhere. And after a while, I started to get a little dismayed in that I understand people want clicks, they want to make money, and every reaction video I saw was always, yeah, this was great, even though I'm going, really? Whereas when I saw yours, it was not that way at all. The format was very, very different. And I found an immense amount of honesty in what you were putting forward. And that you, although you were being diplomatic in your comments, as a fellow musician, I was able to read between the lines in certain cases. But additionally, you were saying it as you were truly feeling it. And I could relate to it because you were experiencing many of the things that I experienced when I heard that kind of music for the first time, whether it be the Led Zeppelin Stairway to Heaven or Metallica, which was a great song you picked in Justice for All, and songs of that nature. And that's what inspired me to actually contact you and say, look, one of the things I believe that you were lacking, and that's not a derogatory term, it's one of simply not knowing, you didn't have context in what you were talking about. And whereas because of my extensive experience in music, especially in the rock genre, although I am fully versed on jazz and big band and classical and everything else, I could see that there were potentially holes missing in your education as to this style of music. That then encouraged me to contact you and say, look, I'm here as a resource if you want me. If you don't, that's not a problem. And I understand your trepidation of just contacting and responding to a person who you don't know who that person is. But of course, it was very sincere what I was putting forward. But again, what I'd like to stress before we carry on with our conversation this evening is that it was the sincerity of what you were doing and the honesty came through very loud and clear to me. And I thought, this has potential. It's not like any other music programs I've watched or reaction videos. And I think this has the ability to take us in places that other viewers of your channel might be very, very interested in. So yes, with our conversations and getting back and forth, I found you to be friendly and inviting. The same with Vlad, your husband. And then, of course, I told you you're my first Romanian friends, and you told me I was your first Canadian friend. And that made me happy because it's always good to have friends. And so I thought, this is wonderful. And the good news is from where you live, which I will not state where it is, from where I live, we're about a 9-hour drive apart. And Graham will tell you, we drove to Texas one time and did 36 hours in one straight run.
It was after that event with the Rush meetup. It was 37 hours.
Straight driving.
Straight.
And I drove the entire way.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, this has opportunity as well. Because as I've already discussed with yourself and Vlad, we're going to meet and we can carry on the project that you're going to discuss further. Sorry?
I said, and I'm very much looking forward to that.
Yes, and we'll be able to do more together as we experience this knowledge that you're going to gain, at least I hope you will gain, from discussions with myself and also my two buddies here, who are extremely knowledgeable across the whole spectrum. And that's where we feel that we can enhance your YouTube channel and do something that's productive, not for us, although it is for you, but more for your audience, because you may have audience members out there, high audience members, who may not be as well versed on this kind of music that we're going to be discussing in the future, which is of the rock genre. So that's what inspired me to meet with you and carry forth with this possible adventure that we're going to place ourselves on. That's it for me.
Yeah, and what you brought up about my channel being different, well, you've probably, as everybody on my channel has probably figured out by now, I spend most of my life making real music in real contexts, and I don't spend a lot of time on YouTube. I have never watched reaction channels. It was just never anything I did. And so this whole project developed conversations between Vlad and myself. You know, he's talking about the music he's passionate about. I'm talking the music I love, and we have our places where the music meets, and we're both passionate about it. And the idea developed of, why don't I just give it a try and test out this, and while we're at it, why don't we make it a public journey and make it educational for everybody along the way? And I am passionate about education and learning and exploring, not only for myself. I love to push myself to my limits as far as I can. I do have limits, and I like to see how close to the edge I can get myself, because I feel like that is where I grow fastest and most rapidly. Well, I know that's the way it works. That's the science of learning. And so that was the whole idea of my whole idea behind starting the channel. It wasn't to start a reaction channel. I guess I didn't even know that existed. It was more to kind of document and share my journey and my reactions, and at the same time share some of my knowledge along the way. And that's how it started. That's how, and the basic premise of discovery, exploration, and education are kind of, those are the things that I am looking to preserve and develop in the channel and in this experience. And that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about this project we have coming up, which we can talk about in a minute, because I feel like it's a real gift to me, and I feel like it's going to be a real gift to the community within Virgin Rock, and I hope that it turns out in such a way that it can be not only entertaining, but really truly valuable for anybody who cares to follow along.
I agree wholeheartedly. And this idea of us moving forward for your audience's purposes, I'm going to say it straight up. Amy and I have been discussing this for a little while now, because we haven't known each other for very long. But we've decided to do a series of programs. We haven't finalized the name, but we're looking at potentially the history of rock music with Amy and Carl. But what it's going to be about, it's about Amy's journey, as she already said, into a more structured approach. And we're going to be starting right back at 1937 with Benny Goodman's song Sing, 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 and moving forward right up to present day with the latest music that's going on. But it's going to be rock-centric. And although rock music wasn't available in 1937, its origins start there. And we'll be tracing through the elements in a structured way so that Amy gets context to how this music developed, the personalities involved, the styles, and how they became the style of rock, because there are many subgenres to rock, how it started to develop into the form that we see today. Now, the great thing is Graham here, who I've already pointed out is a magnificent guitarist. He's going to actually do a lead-in presentation on the solid body guitar and explain to you about its role within rock music. I will be doing the same on the drum set for you and showing you how the rhythms morphed from 1937 and the blues style, and how that eventually turned into rock music. And Tice, who of course understands it all, he will be giving feedback on how the composition structure changed, but also how we developed in the piano/keyboard realm and how that progressed through it. So those will be introductory presentations that we provide, and then we will formally start into the series with you, Amy, where you and I pick selected songs. And I wish to make this point very clear to everybody right now. When I came up with my initial list of songs for Amy that I thought might be influential, important songs, I had 250 songs on the list. That is not going to be able to be done for this particular series, although in the future we will likely get into those styles. So Casey and the Sunshine Band and Master Flash and the Furious Five and bands like this, they're not really rock, but they are popular and in the contemporary zone. So once we've looked at rock music, we will then extend ourselves likely into those other areas and take a deeper look at things like heavy metal and what its importance. And yes, there are people who will write the genre off. You're missing out. The heavy metal genre is so expansive that I could play you music and you'll say, that's not heavy metal. Oh, yes, it is. So these are the kind of concepts and things that we will be going and looking at. So if I don't have one of your favorite songs on the list, I'm sorry. And the reason I'm sorry is because we all like to find people like Amy who discover songs we like. But what I do guarantee is that there are going to be songs on that list that you know and you like. And it's important that Amy be exposed to those. So that's my point on that front, Amy. Thank you.
Yes, and this is a good time for me to explain one of the reasons that, because some of you are paying to request songs on the channel right now, one of the reasons that we may be rejecting some of those requests is because I'm going to be checking each one with Carl and say, is this going to feature in my journey down this road of history and development of rock music? And if so, I'm going to save it for this project because I feel like this project needs the material that it requires to do well. And so that doesn't necessarily mean I reject your particular song choice. I simply am going to say, look, you get your money back for this one because I can't do it right now because I have to save the first listen experience for when it comes in the course of this study project. So that aside, just so everyone understands how this is all working together. Carl, you were talking about saying you can name pieces of heavy metal that we wouldn't guess would be heavy metal, and you can say, yes, it is. That means there are definitions, specific definitions for certain genres and subgenres and kinds of music. And as a musician, I understand that from my classical background. It's like I can say, this is a symphony, this is a concerto, this is Baroque, this is classical, this is, any other sub or small genre or style or branch within the larger context, because I can identify certain characteristics that are specific and are markers for that. So with that in mind, maybe a good place for us to start would be for you to help us get a definition of rock music. What defines rock music? Because obviously that's going to be the
Okay.
focus of this.
I'm actually going to pass this over to my buddies, and we're going to kind of almost have a little discussion. And
Round table.
All right.
yeah, and I've already said to them, feel free to interject with one another, so it's not that Carl talks and Graham talks.
Yeah.
No, we're going to talk about this as a group, and if we disagree with one another, we'll put in the reasons why we do. But then,
Got it.
knowing these guys as well as I do, we probably agree on most things we're about to talk about. But I'm going to pass it to Graham right now to give his definition of rock music, and then Graham, after you're done, if we have things to add, we can then throw it on top.
Sure.
So why don't you kick off for us?
I think it's no surprise, being a guitar player, for me, for something to qualify as rock, it's got to have guitar to it. I know that's not an exact answer because there are certainly lots of examples, or I guess exceptions to that. Thinking of it more in terms of the dynamic of the music, or the quality, or the personality of the music. Rock music for me is always something that has an edge, or has an element of danger to it. It's almost like if you haven't offended somebody, it's probably not rock music, right?
Right.
And I think that the development of the music is something, when you look through it historically, that kind of follows that trend. It almost seems like over the course of all of these little subgenres, whether we're talking about, branching off into things like heavy metal or, grunge, whatever you want to consider that to be, or other like indie genres that are coming out,
or even standard rock and roll,
or even standard, exactly. In what is it, the early 1950s? There's almost this element of getting people's attention with like risk or shock, or it could be volume level, it could be the content of the lyrics, it could be the sound of the instrumentation,
and it could be, correct me if I'm wrong, it can also be the social political environment, such as Chuck Berry, an African American who's playing for white kids in a segregated South.
Sure.
You're going to have that major, that's the offensive part of it.
Right.
We, of course, today don't understand that because we're very egalitarian. We here in Canada especially are very open towards all cultures. And so that comes into play as well with the political, social area. Yeah, carry on, please. Go ahead, Amy.
So I'm just thinking of the handful that I have listened to so far, and well, I'm thinking of Brothers in Arms. It has guitar. It's I guess I wouldn't say that it's orally offensive, but it does tackle a subject which is kind of touchy, right?
Oh yes.
Yep.
So that might be why you would qualify it as rock.
And I'm appropriately dressed for that particular song.
That's
Yes,
right.
you are.
Right? Yes.
Right.
I'm thinking of one of the first ones I listened to, Love of My Life, which when I listened to it, I was like, is this rock? Really? Well, it did have some guitar in it, didn't it? And of course it had harp and all of that. But the content, the subject matter, maybe wasn't terribly offensive, but it has guitar in it, so
I would wonder about that for the time period.
yeah.
Who was Freddie Mercury talking about or talking to?
Well, you're
Right?
right. You're right. Actually,
Now,
you
in
just
this day
pointed
and
something
age,
out that I was
Right?
Yeah.
Love
Got it.
between two guys is not necessarily something that people would find offensive, but back then,
Not between us. We're all good friends. And I don't mean that sarcastically either. I've told these guys before, I love Graham and I love Tice. We are totally cool with that type. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, you just gave me the key for that. I was like, okay, yeah, that I understand that. Okay, got it.
Tice, can you talk about the compositional side? Because you, especially with you, whether you're doing a etude, a symphony, an opera, or whatever, it's very different to what we do. And you were one of the prime people helping us to compose an opus rex.
Right.
How is that different from the classical genre?
I guess it sort of depends on what classical genre. There's a wide berth there that you're working with. I think to jump off Graham's point, the attitude I get, especially from like the earliest rock music, is they don't care what other people think. This is what they're going to do. This is not meant to be on a radio, be played anywhere. This is the music that they just want to create. And I think we sort of get less and less of that as time goes on. There's just sort of more norms that come out and less that you can surprise people with, I guess.
I guess as you're talking about this, I keep thinking of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, like that sort of make a statement. It doesn't matter who's paying attention.
Yeah.
or what they're thinking,
Yeah. And you guys would know much better about the earliest rock music than I would, but compositionally, the pieces are not over the top complicated. They're not over the top simple either. You can tell it's made by guys and girls that just want to make music, right? I think that's what I always keep going back to.
I agree. It's a very genuine thing. Now, I brought up this before to you, Amy, in our discussions. One has to, and correct me if I'm wrong, either one of you. If you look at rock music is the common person's music. If we go back to the 1500s, 1600 period, right the way up to the 1800s, when it comes to classical music, who was listening to the symphony orchestras? Who was listening to the opulent baroqueness, for lack of a better term, of something that Bach was doing? It wasn't a person living in the street who had no form of mass communication. They had no radio. They had no records to listen to, or CDs or anything else recording music-wise. So my position would be where rock, not all, but where rock music really does start to depart is that in classical music, even to this very day today, it's often listened to by aristocracy or people who are well-to-do. Now, so that means then back in the 15 and 1600s, what were the people living in the local villages listening to? Well, they were listening to minstrels and things.
Tavern.
Yeah, tavern kind of music.
Sure.
They were having their village dances and whatever, and they had... Well, it's interesting you mentioned Bach, because Bach, as we know, came from this long line and great extended family of musicians, many of whom were, town musicians.
Yes.
Somebody who's hired for a job in a town where he's not necessarily playing for the highest prince of the region, but there was very much a musical life woven into the everyday population, which wasn't necessarily what they were listening to in the courts and palaces.
Right. And
I guess what I would say is, in terms of classical music, or I should say Western art music, but classical, I'm speaking generically, right? Most of the common population's exposure would come in their church attendance.
Yes.
Because so much of it was religious. But as far as in their everyday lives, then it was folk music and stuff like that.
And I would argue rock music has supplanted that because of instrumentation. I'll talk about drums in a moment, because that's another significant point to this. When we take a look at the modern rock song, and again, mass media plays into this, the politics play into it. When I was growing up, the average musical composition is a rock piece, whether it be by the Beatles, Rolling Stones, whoever. The maximum you were looking at was 3 to 3.5 minutes. So you had 3 to 3.5 minutes to express what it is that you needed to express. Whereas in symphonic music and other forms of classical, and I know they're the minstrels and the shorter pieces, but you had considerably more time to explore and express what it was that you were doing. So when we're looking at rock music, I believe we need to look at it from the context that, as Graham said, this is rebellious music. And Tice started to talk about it, but because of his understanding of earlier music, probably isn't as defined as mine. I remember punk rock when it came out. My favorite band of the punk rock period was the Sex Pistols. You want to talk about offensive, and these were musicians that were playing who had no musical skill whatsoever, and some people might turn around and say, yeah, it sounds like it. I don't agree with that. But as Graham and Tyson both pointed out, this is music that's being developed by not necessarily trained musicians, but people, when they hear stuff, they like the particular sound of something. Jimi Hendrix, with his sound on his guitar. One of the things that made Jimi Hendrix great, not only was his feel, but it was the unique sound of what's going on within the instrument, which pulls me now to the drum set. In order to be a rock song, you must have a drum set. And some people will say, yeah, but drum sets have been all over the place. They were in jazz and everything else. Yes, but not the same as they are in rock. And if you take a look at country in the 1950s thereabout, there were no drummers in those bands. They were too loud for the music. Whereas once we got to amplified music, drums took on their own role. And I would argue, in order to be a rock piece of music, you must have a drum set. And the key is the bass drum. Because the bass drum, and I will explain more about that when I get a chance to do a presentation with you about the drums specifically. But the bass drum is what gives the music the drive, the forward momentum, the aggressiveness that rock needs. and it's something you can dance to. So even though you've got this aggressive form of music, and it may be rebellious or anything else, even in punk rock, we used to do the pogo. You straightened your body up and down, and you jumped up and down like you were a tribesman from somewhere in Africa. Because the Zambezi tribesmen used to jump up and down, and you can see videos of this on National Geographic. It's real. The pogo is very similar to that. So, yeah, when it comes to expressing ourselves in rock music, there is that element. The drums are a big element, and it gives it the music the groove, which when supported by an electric guitar with guitar solos and the guitar itself, you now start to get that full package.
Yeah, it very much has a dance element that's rough around the edges.
Yeah.
Like modern dance music is nothing like this, but it conveys a bit of the same emotion or the same feeling to anyone listening.
It's very tribal.
Yeah.
It's very tribal, and you can even see that in the politics of music as well. We are heavy metal musicians. We're not just heavy metal musicians. You can define us as musicians. But I relate to being a heavy metal drummer. It's what I do, and people tell me I do it very well. That doesn't negate the fact that I have a love for music overall. But when I meet other heavy metal guys, it's like right on. We have this immediate connection. And that connection is part of the music and why the music is as popular as it is. So you'll find some people who are into hip hop. You'll find other people who are into pop music. And then you'll find the other guys like us who are into heavy metal or classic rock or whatever it is that we want to call it. But it does have those elements of the guitar and the drums. Yeah. So over to you.
For the keyboard.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, this starts to come out more and more as technology advances. But you can think of like the earliest rock music being akin to almost like saloon, like, I don't know, the earliest case of piano in rock music.
Well, Jerry Lee Lewis and people like that.
It's very heavy-handed.
Yes,
it's
very.
It's almost like a straightened ragtime.
That
kind of what.
There's one thing I've noticed. One thing I've noticed about piano, the piano sound when it comes in these songs that I'm listening to, it's not the nice piano sound that I look for on a concert stage. Even the tone quality of it, I feel like I'm listening to some piano that's got worn out hammers or something like that.
It's very much a percussion instrument in that sense, a rhythm instrument, almost.
Yeah,
right.
It does function as a rhythm instrument.
Yeah,
but I guess one of my questions has been: is it because there's something attractive and appealing in that? I don't say this in a degrading way, but if I were judging a piano, I'd say that's a bad piano. So I'm going to say this bad piano sound. Or is it just that, I don't know, maybe because it didn't develop on the concert stage. It was more whatever piano they could round up. Is that just what became associated with it? Or why is that piano sound like it's got worn out hammers, the strings need replacing, something is off?
It's the
why
drummer's
is
fault.
that?
Yeah.
It's the drummer's fault.
It is.
It is.
They're too loud.
Yeah.
If you play nice,
I'm going to drown you out.
You can't hear the piano.
But here's the other thing.
I'm not talking about volume. I'm talking about tone quality.
Sure, but hold on a second here. And this is where we are going to educate you in the future.
Okay.
Dream Theater.
Yes.
What's their piano sound like?
It sounds like
a concert grand. It sounds like you're listening to a Yamaha concert grand. And it's only because you've only listened to a very small sliver of the music.
Yeah, I've just listened to a very small.
Part of that too is just the technology advanced to the point where
time period too.
Yeah,
you can compete with anything with a synthesizer. Right?
Yeah, because you just turn it up because you got amplifiers. So now it's not the drummer's fault anymore because the drummer's too loud. Turn everyone up.
But a lot of the early use of pianos, because we're talking about acoustic pianos that have been available. Mm-hmm. You know, you're getting in the room or the venue or wherever you're playing, and you've got to compete with an acoustic drum kit. You've got to compete with a guitar that's now been amplified to
and this
whatever level.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, the other thing is when you have quote-unquote amateur musicians making rock music, they're not going to want to spend thousands of dollars on a piano that's going to be a pain to lug around.
Fair
That's You want what's available and
Well,
go.
and the other thing too is if you take a look at the development of music in the 20th century, if we go back to the 1910s, you're looking at ragtime and music of this
Yeah.
nature. Now, what a lot of people
Yeah.
don't realize is many of the musicians then used to take thumbtacks and push them into the hammers on a piano to get that ragtime sound.
Metallic.
Yeah.
attack.
Now, as you
Yeah.
started to move forward, this
You know,
is
this
where
is so interesting. Go ahead, finish talking, and then I'm going to say something.
not a problem. So this is where we've got to talk about this development through here into the rock period. But if you take a look at the early pianists, whether it's Fats Domino, who didn't play a tinny sounding instrument, but you look at Jerry Lee Lewis. Jerry Lee Lewis was all about energy. And, you know, he would jump up and start hammering on the piano with his feet. And again, I will introduce you to some of the stuff he did. And, you know, the teardowns on the keys and just slamming away on it because, yes, it's loud, it's abrasive. And don't anyone take this the wrong way. The girls loved it. And as rock musicians, many male rock musicians do it because it's appealing to the opposite sex. And yes, there are female musicians who also do it because it's appealing to the male sex. So again, now we're getting into the socialization of what is music all about. I wouldn't myself, my wife, one of the reasons we met and joined forces, she loves heavy metal music. It was a match made in heaven because, yeah, I didn't want someone who was into hip hop. Nothing against hip hop. That's why it's just not my style of music. And as I said earlier on, the tribal element. Hey, I found a fellow woman who loves Rush, who loves Dream Theater, who loves Opeth, who loves Tool. That means something to me. Anyway, I'm sorry I interrupted you more on the piano side. But why don't you talk a bit about, as we moved into the synthesizer period, like Emerson, Lake and Palmer and bands like this. Go ahead.
Let me just say what I thought of, because I was, as you were talking about the thumbtacks and all, I got to thinking, well, we have this sort of thing in classical music too, where not so much with the piano, but you know, if we go further back, we have the harpsichord, which is an earlier keyboard instrument, which sounds nothing like the piano, and in certain contexts, you don't want to hear it, but it's fabulous to give a certain texture and articulative effect. Of course, it's much quieter than would work very well in rock music unless you amp it up. But I'm also thinking of harps, and harps also, historically we have what's called the Bray harp, where you actually, it was a traditional way of amplifying the sound to compete with other instruments and to project further. And that is, you would put this little piece of bone or wood or leather that would vibrate against the strings and make it sound kind of like a hornet's nest when you play, you know, just buzz, buzz. And so I guess I can understand that. It's just that, you know, I've listened to some of these. Let me just say, for example, Love of My Life. It's so smooth. He has this lush modern harp sound. And his voice is so colorful. And then he's got this little, when I did the review, I commented about how it sounds like an early pianoforte. But it's not. It's I don't know if it's just the modifications of recording, or if the piano actually sounded like that, or if it was a texture thing. It's just one of the things that I've noticed with the way the piano features in the music I've listened to so far. So anyway, you can go on and talk, but I just wanted to bring that up.
And I can't think, I'm trying to remember the tone of that piano, but like early synthesized piano or sampled piano sounds terrible. And depending on who you're listening to and from what era, you may just be getting very early electronic piano. Yeah. But as the technology advanced for keyboard in particular, suddenly you didn't just need to wail and play loud to keep up. You had a volume knob that would do it for you. and you had all these pianists and classically trained musicians that had spent years and thousands, tens of thousands of hours training and practicing, can now compete on par, I guess, on one aspect, volume-wise, with the rest of a rock band, but also just in terms of the possibilities, I guess. The same musician can play thousands of different synthesizers, can play a string arrangement, can play a brass arrangement, can play an instrument entirely made of dog voices. Like, the possibilities are endless there.
I think that
I've been corrected on my channel. I've been corrected on my channel more than once when I refer to the string section or the orchestra, and they're like, "That's a synthesizer," and I'm like,
right,
okay, but
it's
emulating the strings.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Graham.
I think that at the core of rock music, and especially through the development from the 1950s on, I mean, even to today, technology plays a very, very large role on how the music developed. Everything from the volume that's achieved, or the way the musicians actually work together, the recording processes that were used, the kinds of sounds that are produced. I mean, the invention of even something like, say, metal music, you don't get that without high amounts of distortion on the guitars. And I think, again, that's going to be something that I talk about in detail, is not just necessarily the idea of guitars that always existed, but a particular kind of guitar that's been designed to deal with that type of situation without, feeding back into horrible noises that you could never use on a stage. So that, again, whether it's keyboard, I mean, the drum set had the same type of thing.
Huge development.
What was that Neil Peart kit you played?
Tin
From the
Can.
1970s.
Oh, yeah. We were at the Percussive Arts Society International Conference, and I got onto a drum set. It was Rush's first. In fact, there's a picture through the door I'm looking at right now. It was a 1974 set of Slingerland drums, and I played on it. It was like, oh my God, how did he sound so good on a drum set that sounded so bad? Whereas I'm used to myself playing on very high quality equipment. Like, it's nothing for me to drop $20,000 on a drum set. But it's because what I'm looking for is the timbre of the instrument, the sound quality, the ease of tuning, plus how it just generally looks. And it's the same with guitarists. And Graham and I, we have numerous conversations. It's not so big on the synthesizer side, because the synthesizer is developing artificial sounds which emulate another kind of sound. One keyboard compared to another keyboard, there's not humongous differences between them if it's at the same time period. So if I was to take a top-of-the-line Yamaha keyboard today and the top-of-the-line Korg keyboard today, they would be comparable. Drum sets are not like that.
Well, and drums and guitar, there's an element of acoustics there.
Totally true.
I was just going to say, it sounds more like the situation we have with any acoustic instrument, whether it's a harp or a violin or piano or something, where it depends on the materials put into it, what sort of sound it can produce.
Totally.
And the quality of the workmanship involved.
Agreed. So, in essence, I want to wrap up this thing in a nice, neat ball, if you don't mind. So, when we had sat down and talked...
There was something actually that might be important to talk about. And
please.
This is the societal root of rock music, and I think why it really came about. In the 1950s, and I think even to a greater degree in the 1960s, there was certainly a change in society in terms of where the prominent figures of the family or the independence of usually the kids.
Teenagers.
Where you have this movement in the youth where they're now essentially provided the opportunity to self-identify.
Totally.
Right? Before that time period, and again, I wasn't alive during that time period, but before that time period, the idea was you were identified by your family, by your parents. And so this change was taking place at a time when this music started to come forward. And I believe there's a lot of teenagers, a lot of kids, even whether it could be young adults as well, who connected with that, who could say, this is how I feel, this is what I'm feeling, I'm going through this too. So you have that support that's fostered behind this, and of course the music takes off. And every generation has their own version of that, I think, even to this day.
Yep.
Right.
Sometimes it's not necessarily in rock music, because I know hip-hop has become
Yeah.
incredibly
The prevalent
popular.
music,
But
yeah.
you still have that same identification through sound that takes place.
You bring up a great point. And here's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
thing. Here's the thing your audience doesn't know about me. Tice has his degree in music from University of Western Ontario. Graham has a physics and computer science degree from Western Ontario. And I have my history degree from the University of Western Ontario.
Yay for
And I
history.
focused on American history. So with my specialty being the American Civil War. But enough of that for the moment. What Graham is talking about is very true. The invention, if we want to call it that, of the teenager is very, very recent. Because, as Graham pointed out, rightly so, in the 1910s, the child was not a child. They were just a mini adult. And they took on the same characteristics as their parents because things were moving along so slowly. By the time you get, I would say, post-World War II is when the real change started to happen. Because America went through a massive expansion of economic wealth. You now had automobiles that were readily available to all people. And as we know with America, the idea of the automobile is freedom. And because of this, you now had teenagers who once were pigeonholed into, you're just a miniature adult. They were starting to find their own identity. So they had their own loves. And one of the cheap ways, or inexpensive ways, to define oneself was by the music you listen to. Because again, radio was prevalent. You could have a transistor radio, listen to the music that you enjoyed, and the more your parents disliked it, the more you liked it. Because that's the rebellious nature of children.
That's teenagers.
Exactly.
No matter what time
generation. And so
Yeah.
with Graham's point, and it's a very well established one, is that this idea of finding your own identity, music was a superb way of doing it, and it still is to this very day. It affects the fashions we wear. Of course, it affects the music we listen to naturally. It affects the cultural changes, what we see on TV, the styles of cars we drive, the type of computers we buy, in my day, the iPods, the Walkman. All of these things go into giving an identity which was non-existent in the 19th century. This is a 20th century and 21st century phenomenon that's going on.
Yes, I agree.
And it's something, I agree, Graham, I'm glad you brought that up, that the societal and political, and there's the other part of it, the political changes. If you take a look throughout the 20th century, whether it's fascism in the 1930s and 40s, and unfortunately some of that's coming back today, but during that period, if you listen to music from Nazi Germany, it was probably Marshall music you were listening to. It wasn't big band swing. That was outlawed by the Nazi Party. That was seen as decadent and something you don't listen to. But moving forward from there, again, once the African Americans started to really truly fight for their freedom, because the Emancipation Proclamation did not do that for them, but once they really started this movement of these people have rights just like the rest of us, that's when we were exposed to much of the culture, and music being a big part of the culture, especially of the African American community. Just go to any Baptist church on a Sunday. They have the best music out there. Because, yes, it's part of their culture. And so as we developed, this political level started to change. And we will discuss this more in future. Take a look at the Beatles and the use of drugs. The idea of, no, this is an egalitarian project, in that you will find, historically speaking, white people will play music with a black person or an African American person at the drop of a hat. Why? Because we don't judge you on the color of your skin. We judge you on how well you play the instrument. So the music has had a huge impact on us politically, as well as Graham pointed out, societally, and also instrumentation-wise.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can see that. And as you were just saying, musicians tend to, I guess probably you could broaden it out beyond the musical arts too, into the other arts as well. But even historically in Europe, you find these instances of misfits and not societally approved members being an integral part of the artistic community. And they're there, they're respected there, they are valued, and they are recognized because of their artistic skill. But again, you make the point of that was in a rather high society context. So now to bring it down and have that sort of inclusiveness in public view, just society in general, where suddenly everybody knows about this person's lifestyle or background or whatever, that's a pretty big thing to have them embraced on an equal footing.
Mm-hmm. And that goes back to the common man idea.
Yeah.
So what we've determined, and please, again, gentlemen, correct me if I'm incorrect here. What we're saying to you, Amy, is that rock music, we're not talking about pop or contemporary or alternative or hip-hop or new wave or any of this. Disco, it doesn't matter. There are certain fundamentals to rock music. Instrumentation is the first one. It's got to include a guitar. And I would argue, I would take it one step further. If it's going to be a real rock song, it better have a guitar solo in it. But that's just my opinion. You got to have a drum set in there. And you better have a really strong bass drum. And I'll get more and demonstrate to you on another meeting where I show you the relationships between the various parts of the drum set and how that works for rock music. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the piano was used in early forms of rock and roll music, and then it developed because the technology, as Tice brought out, as we started to move forward. So you need those three instruments. Also, in rock music, there will normally be a bass player, which makes up the rhythm section, because the bass player generally, he or she will work very closely with the drummer to set the foundation for the danceability that we were talking about. Then, on top of all the instrumentation, as Graham pointed out, you also have an element of rawness and also of rebelliousness against society, your parents, whatever the case may be. So you have the social implications of rock music, which are very different from many other forms of music, which, again, using classical, especially the march form of music, that's actually a unifier to make us all the same. And I know as a military officer, we believe in uniformity. Rock is not that. And then finally, on top of the social side, there's the political element to it. And politics has a massive influence on what goes on. I was thinking about, I can't think of the name of the song, but I did look it up. Who's the famous, Bob Dylan.
Oh, that guy.
Yes, that guy. Yeah, that little unknown guy out there. When he did
I even know that name. I don't know the music, but I recognize the name.
And he's not rock music, so we're not going to look at him for the time being. We'll look at him in future. But when he came out with a lot of his protest music, it had a huge impact on society and started its own realization of the folk industry and where that music took them. So there's that element to it as well on the political side. And again, one of the songs I have on my list for you is God Save the Queen by the Sex Pistols. Yeah, you're going to hear protesting. You're going to hear stuff that is very, very offensive to many, but what offends you may not offend me, and vice versa. And you and I have discussed this in previous conversations. The beauty of music is all of us have our own taste in what we enjoy, and that's what's so amazing about it. And yet, even though we all have our own taste in music, when I go to an Iron Maiden concert, I am at one with everybody with me. When I go to a Rammstein concert, I am at one with everybody who is there. And it's not the same as we've discussed about classical music, where if you burp or sneeze, that's seen as an affront to the music. Hell no! Let's have a mosh pit and get on with it in rock music. So the whole attitude towards it is quite different. Do you guys have anything else that I missed that you want to add on that one?
I don't think so.
No. And that's what we define as rock music. And of course, as we discuss this more, Amy, we're going to refine it. And you're going to see how it changed through the decades. and how we ended up where we ended up today with the modern rock music we have today compared to that started out with Bill Haley and the Comets and people of his ilk and what they were doing with this rebellious music, which by today's standards, we laugh and go,
It's pretty,
really?
It's pretty tame. Yeah.
Really? So, yeah.
Yeah.
So do you have any other questions for us?
Not at the moment. I'm going to kind of let this all settle and think it through. But what you're saying makes perfect sense. You know, I am super excited about getting introduced to the guitar and the drums and you know, I'm a pianist. I am not a keyboardist in terms of rock music. So maybe there's even something that Tice wants to show me about
Hidden
synthesizer
there.
or keyboard. I you know, we'll get there. But I'm looking forward to that. And
One thing too, Amy, I'm going to be tracking this line of discussion and stuff on this because I'm certain that there are many of the people who watch your show may disagree with us, and that's fine. You can disagree with me all you want. You're wrong, but you can disagree with me. And I'm just kidding. But it's good for discussion purposes. So if you have comments, I'm talking to your audience now, please put them in the bottom. I will read through them and I will comment on them and we can have a discussion going. The only thing I wish to present though is be polite. Do not get personal with me. If you get personal with me, you're going to have a mean guy on the other end of the comments coming back at you. Let's discuss this as rational. Tell me what you think about what we've said. If we've missed something, hey, all of us are fallible. And that's why I asked the two guys here with me today, because again, you've seen on a number of occasions, they've picked up on things I had left out, but oh yeah, what about this? And so let's get this discussion going, particularly before we start our program of the history of rock with Amy and Carl, so that we have the feedback from your audience of what they think.
yes, I think that's fabulous. And I'll be following the comments too, of course, as I always do. And I think that we won't be disappointed in the comment quality, because I have been very pleasantly surprised at the civility and the level of decency on the channel, which I was not expecting when I first put it up. I was like, okay, there's probably going to be a lot that I'll block and whatever. There's only been one. Vlad's holding up his finger. There's only been one that we've had to block so far. So
And that was a heavy metal guy.
I don't even know. He takes care of it for me. So I think that we can have a fabulous discussion, all of us together, and I'm excited. I'm like really looking forward to this, and so I think that's wonderful. And I want to thank each of you, Graham, Carl, Tice, for taking the time out of your hectic schedule for this tonight and putting all your energy into it, and I so appreciate it. And Vlad's saying something. What?
We'll meet soon.
Oh, yes. He's saying, yes, we'll meet soon.
Yes. And
We'll meet
one
soon.
point,
And-
one point too, Amy, in case your audience is wondering why we're looking up and not necessarily at the camera,
Up and-
our camera is down here.
Different
You're up
screens.
there. And so I
Same
caught
here.
myself halfway through our presentation. I'm looking at you on the screen of our TV, and your audience is probably going, what the heck is he looking at? I'm looking at you, but you're on the TV, whereas down here is what we're doing the recording with.
We're doing this long distance. It's not ideal. I would love for us all to be in the same room.
Yeah.
And we will be in the same room at
Yes.
some point.
Yes.
But it makes no sense for us to wait until the perfect moment to start. So I so appreciate everything from all of you. And I'm looking forward to next time.
Thanks for having us.
Yes,
Yes, thank you.
And yeah, until we meet
All
again.
right.
Okay,
Thank
thanks.
you very much. And have a great evening.
You too.